Hello, I'm Joshua Unruh, your superhero scholar. Welcome to Superhero University on Captain Marvel, Earth's Mightiest Hero. Have a seat. Class is now in session. Well, here we are, a week closer to the release date of Captain Marvel, the movie that introduces Carol Danvers to the MCU. And welcome to the session of Superhero University on the second issue of Captain Marvel, Earth's Mightiest Hero. After a momentous beginning to the admittedly massive remodel and refurbish on the character from last issue, it's time to see where Kelly Sue DeConnick plans to take Carol in the future. We know a bit more about who Carol is. We've been reintroduced to some of the people from her past and the places from which she's come. And we know that going forward, she's adopted the name and mantle of Captain Marvel, as well as accepted the dare to punch holes in the sky. But how exactly will Carol go about punching those holes? Turns out, at least at first, the answer is very literal. So unlike last issue that started out with a fight, this one starts out with an airplane. And what we've learned so far is that this is also very on brand for Carol Danvers. Now, the moral of this story that Carol is telling about Helen seems to be that women are amazing and would just keep on being amazing if men would get the hell out of the way. Helen sets an impossible record in a stolen plane, gets arrested by a man who doesn't like his authority challenged, and then escapes out from under his nose. Helen never was much for doing what she was told. Carol, you're the pot, and the kettle is calling. A couple of beats from this story that I really appreciate. First of all, I like that it's Howard Stark that bought the plane for Helen because he liked her style. But he also repainted it hot rod red. And now you all know where Tony gets it from. I also really appreciate that Carol tells this story of a trailblazing woman mentor of hers to a different trailblazing woman mentor of hers from a different part of Carol's life. It's worlds colliding for Carol in the best way. She is, to the best of her ability, introducing one badass woman that taught Carol how to be a badass to another badass woman that taught Carol how to be a badass in a completely different way. And to that end, I enjoy the banter between Carol and Tracy. I enjoy that they're trading jibes that they have definitely heard from men directed at them at different points in their lives. And that's why it's funny. When Tracy suggests that Carol can't tell jokes, that is definitely a thing that I have heard men say about and to women. Women who were usually funnier than them. And when Carol turns around and suggests that Tracy smile, that is some epic level trolling on the kinds of men who read superhero comics and would feel challenged by a book and a character like Captain Marvel. As we wrap up that story about Helen, as we wrap up that interaction between Carol and Tracy, take note that Carol and Helen are described as the best pilots of their respective generations. Not the best woman pilots, the best, period. Now, while the first and second issues open very differently, I really appreciate how they both move into their second act with flight. Except in the first issue, it was Carol under her own power and lamenting the opportunities she lost as a pilot when she became Captain Marvel. In this one, though, Carol is forced to rely upon an airplane. She is not flying under her own power, and she is working hard to recreate Helen's record rather than being sad about not setting her own. And when she does recreate Helen's record, Carol is legitimately impressed. 30 below is extremely cold, especially when you can't warm yourself with superpowers. But then immediately we see another vital part of Carol Danvers' personality. She always goes a little too far. Proving Helen's record wasn't enough. Now Carol has to set one of her own. And what I find really interesting about this, especially in comparison to our first issue flight, where Carol is upset that she can no longer compete as a pilot in the way that she's used to, this record is less about her as Captain Marvel and more about the plane itself. Captain Marvel can't possibly freeze to death, but she still has to rely on the airplane to not freeze over and stall. "You will not beat me this time," Carol says to Helen. And I think with that line, I can be pretty sure how the duel at dawn mentioned in the first issue's flashback went for Carol. And then when the plane starts to stall out and she starts to lose control, she insists, "Do not lose this plane." She's still Captain Marvel. She's not worried about surviving. But she's also Carol Danvers, and she's worried about this memento of her mentor, this thing that was so important to a woman that was important to Carol. That she's worried about surviving. Cut to black, and welcome to the jungle. Right away, it's obviously weird. There is no wreckage. Carol is right away jumped by people in archaic Japanese uniforms. Take note of another Carol personality trait, but with a startling amount of nuance. She flies off the handle as soon as she's threatened, but then quickly settles down. With normal human beings, especially soldiers, Carol is chill. She doesn't fight or lash out. She has massive empathy for where the soldiers are coming from. She also realizes that they are essentially no threat to her. Normal people get Carol, not Captain Marvel. Here are some Japanese translations for these pages, with special thanks to G.J. Corbin and Tomoki for the translation help. Carol says, "I'm an Avenger." The soldier says, "You just said Captain America. Do you know him, woman?" His compatriot says, "Say it, stupid. Then are you now the Emperor?" Then he says, "Captain America, woman, stop!" And then he says, "Keep walking." Now, leftover soldiers from World War II is an actual real-world phenomenon, although not at all this far into modernity. And it is the first thing that I thought as well. It was my first theory when it came to who these men were and what they were doing, that they are soldiers who didn't know World War II was over. And so it was kind of cool for me personally that was Carol's first guess also. But both of us, Carol and myself, weren't really buying into it. It's the first idea you have, and then you discard it. Another character beat from Carol that I like right here is that she realizes the question about whether anyone speaks English is kind of a crass America-centric thing to ask, and she apologizes. And we get a little more translation. "Captain America, woman, you are our war prisoner." And then, "Grenade!" You probably figured out that grenade one, honestly. Carol leaps into action. She grabs up the grenade, she throws it into the sky, and probably technically there wasn't really any danger to her when it came to the grenade's explosion. She is still a hero here. She doesn't know the score, and so she saves everyone, even the people that have her under gun and guard. But this is also our opportunity to introduce some new heroines. Now, I laughed out loud at the suggestion that Captain Marvel is wearing a circus suit, and it was my first solid suggestion that Carol was time traveling. After all, if you've listened to my other Superhero University episode about superhero costumes, then you already know that Superman's costume, the superhero costume on which all other superhero costumes are in one way or another based, was created from the outfit worn by circus strongmen. And if you talk about Robin the Boy Wonder, a very early addition to the superhero canon, he is literally a circus acrobat, and his outfit is based upon a mixture of Robin Hood and circus acrobatics. This is how I knew it was probably the 40s, even before the women introduced themselves as the Women's Air Service Pilots, Banshee Squad, class of 1943. Now, I want to point out right away, this is continuing our tour of badass women. And much like the Mercury 13, the Women's Air Service Pilots were a real thing. Reading from Wikipedia, the Women Airforce Service Pilots, WASP, also the Women's Army Service Pilots or Women's Auxiliary Service Pilots, were a civilian women pilots organization whose members were United States Federal Civil Service employees. Members of WASP became trained pilots who tested aircraft, ferried aircraft, and trained other pilots. Their purpose was to free up male pilots for combat roles during World War II. And despite various members of the armed forces being involved in the creation of the program, the WASP and its members had no military standing. Now, much like the Mercury 13, I am no expert on this, so there will be a link to Wikipedia in the show notes if you want to read more. And last but not least, this is our confirmation that Carol has traveled back in time to 1943. Now, we get some exposition here, but some of it is confusing. Carol is unhappy with her situation, she's feeling out of her depth, but she isn't freaking out, which I find another compelling personality trait for Carol. She knows she's in a lot of trouble. She knows that this is not the kind of problem that she would typically be called upon to deal with, even as an Avenger. But she also doesn't get excited about it. This is what Avengers do. I do agree with her, though, that it seems weird that the Avengers don't have a handbook, or at least some orientation films. I mean, can you imagine Captain America turning the chair around, sitting down on it, and saying, "So, you found yourself lost in time"? That would be very useful to an Avenger, and honestly, kind of cool for us to get to watch too, right? We tease the Prowlers a lot before we see one, and everyone is scared to death of them. That's some pretty good foreshadowing, considering that we're going to reveal them in just a couple of pages. We also mention another historical fact that I found fascinating. The Royal Air Force of Great Britain was in fact allowing women pilots before the USA was. And this one's just for me, but I'm kind of a collector of old-timey slang, especially from this era, and Killer Diller would have been another dead giveaway to me that we had transported back to the 1940s. Now we get our full reveal of a Prowler, and I like how super tech combines with Carol's unease to make her want to fight. I really appreciated the line, "I want to hit it so bad my fingers tingle." And to be honest, the Prowler is imposing as well as clearly not of 1943. Also, there's a hint to some future things that we'll discover. The feeling of the Prowler is familiar to Carol. It's a tease, and we won't discover fully what it means until next issue, but since we've revisited Carol's origin a couple of times, you can probably make a reasonable guess. Rivka dies on screen, which elevates the stakes for Captain Marvel as she now feels like she has to save these women who had previously saved her. And I'm just going to put this out there and see if anybody else gets the feeling as they read more of the story, but I get the feeling that Daisy and Rivka were an item. Now, we never get that textually laid out for us, but it's something that just feels right for me, and the feeling begins here with Daisy's extreme reaction to Rivka's death. Nobody's happy about it, but Daisy just seems particularly horrified. Am I reading too much in? You guys let me know what you think. And now finally, we get Captain Marvel in all her glory. And I am amused again at how out of her depth Captain Marvel feels and how little it bothers her now that she's in a fight. I'm pretty sure this won't jibe with the butterfly protocols, but let's rewrite some history, shall we? It's the biggest parts of Carol's personality traits wrapped up in 2 lines. And I think that's pretty fantastic writing. So now, we've moved past the resetting of the status quo and are more fully into the story that Ms. DeConnick wants to tell. But it's not divorced from the setup. It's tied directly to Helen through her plane, and tied to Helen, Tracy, and Carol thematically. We're on a tour, a historical tour now, of amazing women. All of whom, at least so far, have been underestimated by men both personally and systemically. I don't think I'm giving away too much to say that we'll see these women rise to the occasion and surpass the patriarchy's low expectations, even as Helen, Tracy, and Carol have. But I am fascinated that DeConnick chose to make this a historical tour. The more I think on it, the more brilliant I think it is. It's easy to get caught up in your own present and start to think that things have always been this way, especially in terms of societal ills like sexism. And this book came out in 2012, so this feeling is even more prevalent and maybe more oppressive in 2019. But through a historical look, we are reminded that we still have a long way to go, but we're also shown how women have always overcome male-dominated nonsense. And we're reminded that we are all, men and women alike, able to overcome the patriarchal system that we find ourselves trapped within. And we don't even need superpowers to do it. Although, let's be honest, they'd probably help quite a bit. And that brings us to the end of the second session of Superhero University on Captain Marvel, Earth's Mightiest Hero. If you have any questions or input, you can find me easily enough on Twitter at Joshua Unruh. And the hashtag is SHUMarvel or just SHU. Please remember that Superhero University is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. Thank you again for joining me for this session of Superhero University, and we'll see you back here for the next part of Captain Marvel, Earth's Mightiest Avenger. Until then, class is dismissed.